The snow fell over Queens like ash from a forgotten fire, blanketing the cracked sidewalks and rusted fire escapes in white silence that did nothing to quiet the grief inside the small bakery at the corner of 73rd and Elm. Elias Costas stood behind the counter, flour dusting his forearms, his fingers still trembling from the morning's kneading even though the last loaf had come out of the oven nearly 2 hours ago. The shop was empty now, as it had been for most of the past 3 weeks, and the handwritten sign in the window, "Closing forever," seemed less like a statement and more like an epitaph. He was 28 years old, with warm olive skin that had lost its glow over the past month, and dark curls that he kept tied back in a loose knot, because his mother had always said he looked more serious that way. His eyes, a deep hazel that customers had once called honey-colored, were now hollowed by shadows that no amount of sleep could erase. He had stopped wearing his scent blocker patches 3 days ago, not out of rebellion, but because he simply no longer cared who might smell the sour notes of grief bleeding through his usual warm bread and cinnamon scent. The bakery had been his dream, his and Mateo's, though Mateo had never actually needed a single batch of dough. They had opened it together 3 years ago, Elias doing all the work while Mateo managed the books and smiled at the customers and slowly, methodically, siphoned every penny from their shared accounts into a private offshore fund that Elias hadn't known existed until the bank called to inform him that his debit card had been declined at the grocery store. That betrayal had come 2 weeks after Elias had buried his daughter. Penelope had been born premature at 6 months, so tiny that she fit in the palm of Elias's hand, with his dark curls and Mateo's sharp nose and a cry, so weak it had barely registered on the monitors. She had lived for 18 hours, and Elias had spent every single one of them holding her against his bare chest, hoping that his omega scent, the same scent that had comforted Mateo through countless panic attacks, might somehow convince her body to keep fighting. It hadn't. The doctors had been kind, the nurses even kinder, but kindness couldn't resurrect a child who had never been given a chance. Elias had returned home to an empty apartment and an even emptier bank account, and for the first time in his life, he had considered simply lying down and never getting back up. The only thing that kept him moving was the milk. His body, oblivious to the loss, continued producing as if Penelope were still there, still hungry, still needing him. Every morning he woke with his chest aching, his shirt soaked through, the biological imperative of his omega biology screaming at him to find his child, to feed his child, to protect his child from the cold and the dark and the terrible silence of a world that had taken her away. He had bought a breast pump out of desperation, not because he had any use for the milk, but because the pressure was becoming unbearable. He stored the bags in the bakery's freezer because his apartment refrigerator had been repossessed along with everything else, and he told himself he would figure out what to do with them later. Later had never come. Now he stood in the empty bakery, watching the snow pile against the windows, and wondered if anyone would even notice when he closed the doors for the last time. The landlord had given him until the end of the week. The suppliers had stopped answering his calls. His mother had stopped answering his calls too, not out of cruelty, but because she didn't know what to say to a son who had lost everything, and Elias couldn't blame her for that. He had just begun bagging the remaining loaves for the local shelter when the bell above the door chimed. Elias looked up, expecting another debt collector or perhaps the landlord come to demand the keys early. Instead, he found a man he did not recognize, lean and clean-shaven, with restless brown eyes and the alert posture of someone who had grown up expecting trouble. The man was dressed in a plain black coat, but something about the way he held himself suggested he was not a customer. "Are you Elias Costas?" the man asked, his voice quiet but precise. "Depends who's asking," Elias replied, his hand instinctively moving toward the rolling pin he kept beneath the counter. The man, Daniel Russo, though Elias wouldn't learn his name until much later, held up both hands in a placating gesture. I'm not here to hurt you. My employer needs to ask you a question. I don't owe anyone money, Elias said flatly. Whatever Mateo told you, it's a lie. He took everything. There's nothing left. Daniel's expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy, quickly suppressed. It's not about money. My employer needs. He paused, clearly choosing his next words carefully. Are you still able to nurse a baby? The question hit Elias like a physical blow. His chest tightened, the familiar ache of his unused milk ducts flaring to life as if in response to the very suggestion of a child in need. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He saw Penelope's face again, her tiny mouth open in a silent cry, her fingers curling around his thumb with a grip that had been so fragile, so desperate, so unbearably brief. What? He managed. One of the nurses at the clinic on 42nd mentioned that you'd recently given birth, Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral. My employer's infant son he's dying. He won't take a bottle. The doctors say he needs to nurse directly, and there's no one else. We've tried everyone. We'll pay anything. Whatever you want. Elias stared at him. The words didn't seem real, couldn't be real. He was a grieving Omega whose body had betrayed him by continuing to produce milk for a child who would never drink it. He was a bankrupt baker who had lost his savings, his business, and his future. He was the kind of person the city had learned to look through as if he no longer existed. And yet, somehow, impossibly, there was a child out there who needed him. Who's your employer? Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel hesitated. I think it's better if you see for yourself. The first thing Elias noticed about the Valeni mansion was the smell. Not the scent of the men who surrounded him. Though there were dozens of them, alpha and beta alike, there sensed a wall of pine and leather and gun oil that would have been intimidating under any other circumstances. No, what struck Elias was the absence of warmth. The air inside the house was cold and sterile, thick with the unspoken grief of a family that had been gutted from the inside. The second thing he noticed was the baby. Elias had seen many infants in his life, had held his niece and his cousin's children and the neighbor's twins, but he had never seen a newborn so close to death. Luca Valeni was small even for his age, with soft black hair and a face that might have been beautiful under different circumstances, but was now pinched with exhaustion and dehydration. His tiny mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, too weak to even cry. And the man holding him made Elias's Omega instincts flare to life with a ferocity that shocked him. The man was tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders and sharp cheekbones and dark hair combed away from a face that might have been carved from granite. His scent was alpha, overwhelmingly alpha, the kind of dominant pheromonal signature that usually made Elias's instincts scream danger. But there was something else beneath it, grief, raw and bottomless, the kind of sorrow that couldn't be hidden behind expensive suits and cold eyes. Adrian Valeni was a man who had never begged for anything in his life. Elias could see that in the way he held himself, the way his jaw was clenched so tight that the muscles beneath his neatly trimmed beard stood out like cords. But as he crossed the room, carrying his dying son with the careful desperation of a man holding the last piece of his broken heart, his voice cracked on the first syllable. Please, he said, and the words seemed to cost him everything. Just once. I'll pay anything. I'll give you anything. Whatever you want, whatever you need. Elias didn't hear the rest. He was already moving, his body responding to the baby's weak cry with an instinct that bypassed every rational thought in his head. His hands reached out, and Adrian placed the infant in them with a reverence that made Elias's chest ache. Give him to me, Elias whispered, more to himself than to the man who had just handed over his entire world. He carried Luca into the small office behind the bakery's main room, the same office where he had spent countless nights planning menus and crying over unpaid bills. and sat down in the old wooden chair that had been his mother's before she'd given it to him. The air still smelled of yeast and cinnamon and cooling bread, the familiar sense of a life that no longer existed. Elias positioned the baby against his chest, careful not to jostle him, and for a long, terrifying moment, nothing happened. Luca's mouth opened and closed weakly, too exhausted to even turn toward the source of the warmth he was pressed against. "Come on," Elias breathed, stroking the baby's cheek with one trembling finger. "Come on, little one. I've got you. You're safe now." He began to hum, a lullaby his own mother had sung to him as a child, a melody about stars and moonlight and the promise of a new morning. His scent, which had been sour with grief for weeks, began to shift, the familiar notes of warm bread and cinnamon rising to the surface, softening the edges of the room. And then Luca turned. It was barely perceptible at first, just the barest movement of his head toward Elias's chest. But then his tiny mouth found what he had been searching for, the instinctive knowledge of where to go, what to do, and he began to nurse. Elias felt the pull deep in his chest, the familiar ache of milk letting down after weeks of painful pressure. He bent over the baby, tears streaming down his face, and held him with the tenderness he had never been able to give his own daughter. This wasn't Penelope. He knew that, would never pretend otherwise, but helping this child survive gave purpose to the grief that had been consuming him. In the doorway, Adrian Valeni stood with both hands hanging uselessly at his sides, watching his son feed for the first time in 3 days. His expression was controlled, but his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, were glistening with something that might have been tears. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The Valeni mansion was the kind of place that photographs could never fully capture. On film, it was beautiful. Vast stone walls, tall windows overlooking manicured gardens, sweeping staircases that seemed to lead to nowhere. In person, it was a mausoleum. Elias had been there for 3 days, and he still hadn't found a single room that felt alive. The staff moved through the corridors like ghosts, their voices hushed, their eyes perpetually scanning for signs of Adrian's approach. Since Isabella's death, 4 housekeepers had resigned without notice. 2 nannies had vanished in the middle of the night, and the kitchen staff had turned over so many times that no one seemed certain who was in charge of anything. Elias understood why. The mansion wasn't just grieving, it was hemorrhaging. But he didn't have time to dwell on the house's emotional state because Luca needed him. Every 2 hours, like clockwork, the baby stirred in his bassinet, his weak cries growing slightly stronger each time, and Elias would lift him into his arms and feed him in the quiet nursery that smelled of formula and antiseptic and the fading traces of Isabella's jasmine perfume. The medical team, led by a silver-haired pediatric specialist named Dr. Samuel Bennett, monitored Luca's progress with clinical precision, but Elias could see the relief in their eyes. The baby was improving. His cheeks were beginning to fill out, his cries were becoming louder and more demanding, and his tiny fingers curled around Elias's thumb with a grip that was almost fierce. But for all the progress Luca was making, Elias found himself increasingly aware of the shadow that lingered in every corner of the mansion. Adrian Valeni. The man was everywhere and nowhere at once. Elias would see him in the doorway of the nursery, standing so still that he might have been a statue, watching his son sleep with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Then he would disappear for hours, and the servants would speak in even lower voices, and the entire house would seem to hold its breath until he returned. Elias had never met anyone like him. An alpha whose scent commanded obedience without effort, whose presence seemed to fill every room he entered, whose eyes could freeze a man mid-sentence. And yet, beneath all that power, there was something achingly fragile. Elias had glimpsed it that first night, when Adrian had stood in the doorway of the bakery office with tears streaming down his face, too overwhelmed by relief to hide his emotions. He had also glimpsed it in the nursery, 2 nights ago, when he'd woken up to feed Luca and found Adrian already there, sitting in the rocking chair with the baby against his chest, his head bent low over the tiny bundle in his arms. He hadn't been sleeping. His eyes had been open, staring at the wall with an emptiness that made Elias's heart clench. "You should be resting," Elias had said softly, not wanting to startle him. Adrian had looked up, and for a moment, his expression had been completely unguarded. He looked exhausted, hollowed out, barely holding himself together. Then the mask had slipped back into place, and he'd said, "I don't sleep much these days." Elias hadn't known what to say to that. He had simply nodded and taken Luca from the alpha's arms, marveling at how gently Adrian transferred the baby, as if he were made of spun glass. That was the paradox of Adrian Valeni, a man who could order men to their deaths without blinking, but who held his infant son like he was afraid of breaking him. The 4th morning, Elias decided he couldn't tolerate the disorder anymore. He had woken up early, fed Luca, and then wandered down to the kitchen in search of something to eat. What he found was chaos. The enormous kitchen was fitted with professional-grade ovens and imported equipment, but it looked like a battlefield. Dirty dishes stacked in the sink, expensive fruit rotting in the pantry, boxes of imported ingredients shoved haphazardly into cabinets, their labels faded from neglect. And in the middle of it all, a heavy-set man in his early 60s stood staring at a cookbook as if it were written in a foreign language. "Can I help you?" Elias asked. The man, Emilio Costa, he would later learn, startled badly, nearly dropping the book. No, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you come in." "That's all right," Elias said, stepping further into the room. "I'm Elias. I'm looking after Luca." "Ah," Emilio said, recognition dawning. "You're the Omega, the one who saved the baby." Elias paused, unsure how to respond. "I did what anyone would do." Emilio snorted softly. "You'd be surprised. Most people wouldn't have come anywhere near this house once they heard the name Valeni." Elias had heard the name, of course. Everyone in New York had heard the name. But he had also heard the sound of a starving baby's cry, and nothing else had seemed to matter. "Your kitchen is a disaster," he said bluntly, changing the subject. Emilio's face crumpled. "I know. I used to run one of the finest hotel kitchens in Manhattan. Now I can't even prepare a decent meal. When was the last time someone actually enjoyed eating here?" "Before," Emilio stopped, his throat working. "Before Isabella died, I used to make things she requested. She had a good palate, Isabella. A good heart, too. She would come down here at night, when Adrian was working, and help me test recipes. She said she wanted the mansion to smell like a home." Elias looked around the kitchen, at the dust on the counters, the expiration dates on the produce, the emptiness of the entire room, and made a decision. "I'm going to need your help," he said. Emilio blinked. "With what?" "With making this place feel like something other than a tomb." The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened faster than anyone expected. Elias started with the pantry, clearing out expired ingredients and organizing the remaining supplies into a system that made sense. He labeled everything: flour, rice, canned goods, spices, in clear handwriting. And when Emilio objected that Adrian hadn't hired him to manage the house, Elias simply said, "I'm tired of watching good food rot while the guards skip meals because there's nothing worth eating." Emilio had looked at him for a long moment, and then he'd laughed for the first time in months. "You have a sharp tongue, Elias Costas." "I have a sharp tongue and a talent for kneading dough," Elias replied, "which is more than most people can say." Within a week, the kitchen had transformed. Elias created simple menus that fed the guards according to their shifts, replacing wasteful individual orders with large, well-prepared meals that brought the staff together in ways no one had anticipated. He taught Emilio to make the sourdough that had been his bakery's signature, and together they worked before dawn, mixing dough and letting it rise while the rest of the mansion slept. The first morning the loaves went into the oven. The smell of warm yeast and butter drifted into the corridors, and something shifted in the house. Guards who usually ate standing began gathering near the kitchen. Men who hadn't exchanged more than a nod in weeks sat together at the long staff table, tearing bread apart with their hands and smiling despite themselves. Elias didn't think much of it. He was just doing what he'd always done, feeding people, nurturing them, using the only skills he had. But the servants looked at him differently after that. Teresa Marino, the senior housekeeper who had greeted him with suspicion on his first day, began leaving him cups of tea in the nursery. Marco De Luca, Adrian's head of security, started greeting him by name when they passed in the hallways. And Adrian began coming home earlier. The first few times, Elias assumed it was coincidence. The Alpha had business meetings, after all, logistics to oversee, deals to negotiate. But then he started appearing in the nursery before midnight, still in his dark overcoat, snow melting on his shoulders, his eyes finding Luca's face as if he needed to confirm the baby was still there. One night, he stayed long after Luca had fallen asleep. Elias sat in the rocking chair, and Adrian stood by the window, his back to the room, staring out at the snow-covered garden. "You've done something to this house," Adrian said eventually, his voice low. "I'm not sure what you mean." "The bread. The kitchen. The way the guards." He paused, shaking his head. "I haven't heard anyone laugh in this place since Isabella died. Now I walk in, and there are people talking, eating together, acting like they're not afraid of their own shadows." "I just made some bread," Elias said, shifting Luca slightly in his arms. "It's not that big a deal." Adrian turned to look at him, and Elias felt the full weight of his attention, the intense focus of an alpha who was used to getting answers. "It is a big deal. You've made this house feel like a home again, and I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't have to thank me. I'm not doing it for you." The words came out more sharply than Elias intended, and he winced inwardly. But Adrian didn't react with anger. Instead, he seemed almost amused. "I know," he said. "That's what makes it worth something." The tension between them had been building for weeks, a slow burn that Elias had been too afraid to acknowledge. It was in the way Adrian's eyes followed him across the room, the way his scent deepened whenever Elias came near, the way his fingers brushed against Elias's whenever they passed Luca between them. Elias told himself it was nothing, just gratitude, just the natural bond that formed when two people cared for the same child. But he knew better. He had known better since the first night, when Adrian had looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes and said, "Thank you," in a voice that had stripped away every pretense of power and control. The moment it finally became undeniable happened on a night when the snow had been falling for hours, blanketing the mansion in a silence so complete that Elias could hear his own heartbeat. Luca had been fed and settled, his tiny chest rising and falling in the rhythm of peaceful sleep. Elias had been about to leave the nursery when Adrian appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I need to talk to you," Adrian said. "About what?" "About this. About us." Adrian stepped into the room, and Elias felt the temperature shift, the air growing thick with the alpha's scent. "I can't keep pretending you're just here for Luca. You're not. You haven't been for weeks." Elias's heart hammered in his chest. "Adrian, You don't have to say anything," Adrian interrupted, moving closer. "Just listen. I've spent my entire life controlling everything. Every person, every situation, every outcome. I thought if I was strong enough, powerful enough, nothing could touch me. But then Isabella died, and Luca was dying, and I couldn't do anything. I couldn't save them. I couldn't even." His voice broke, and he looked away, his jaw tight. "And then you walked into that bakery, and you took my son, and you saved him without asking for anything. You didn't want my money. You didn't want my protection. You just—" He stopped, shaking his head. You just did it because it was the right thing to do. Because you're the kind of person who sees someone in need and doesn't hesitate. Elias felt tears pricking at his eyes. Adrian, let me finish. Adrian stepped closer, close enough that Elias could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the rich, complex notes of his alpha scent beneath the grief and exhaustion. I've been trying to stay away from you. I've been telling myself that you're here for Luca, that you don't owe me anything, that I have no right to want you the way I do. But I can't do it anymore. I can't pretend I don't see you, don't feel you, don't. He reached out, his hand hovering near Elias's face, waiting for permission. Tell me to stop, and I will. Tell me you don't want this, and I'll walk away and never mention it again. Elias should have said no. He should have told Adrian that he was still grieving, still broken, still not ready for anything resembling a relationship. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached up and pressed his hand over Adrian's, guiding it to his cheek. I don't want you to stop, he whispered. I've been trying to pretend too. I've been telling myself that I'm here for Luca, that I don't have the right to feel anything for you. But I do. I feel everything. Adrian let out a shaky breath, and then he was leaning in, his forehead pressing against Elias's, their breath mingling in the small space between them. I don't deserve you, he said. Probably not, Elias agreed, a tear slipping down his cheek. But I'm not going anywhere anyway. Adrian kissed him then, soft and reverent, as if Elias were something precious, something to be treasured. And Elias kissed him back, pouring all the grief and hope and desperate love he'd been holding in his heart into that single moment. The kiss deepened, and Adrian's hands found Elias's waist, pulling him closer. Elias could feel the alpha's need through the layers of clothing, the raw, desperate hunger of a man who had been alone for too long. But Adrian didn't push. He kept the kiss gentle, restrained, as if he was afraid of breaking Elias. It was that restraint, more than anything, that made Elias fall a little bit more in love with him. I want to take this slow, Adrian murmured against his lips. I want to do this right. You've been through so much, and I don't want slow, Elias interrupted, surprising himself with his own boldness. I've been slow. I've been careful. I've been waiting for the other shoe to drop for my entire life. But you. He looked up into Adrian's dark eyes. You make me feel like I can stop waiting. Like I can just be. Adrian's expression softened, the hard edges of his face melting into something almost vulnerable. Then be with me, he said. Not just for Luca. For us. Elias nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. And when Adrian kissed him again, there was nothing gentle about it. Just heat and need and the desperate, beautiful promise of something new. 3 weeks after Elias entered the Valeni mansion, winter deepened its grip on New York, and the snow continued to fall. Luca was thriving now. His cheeks had filled out, his cries were loud and demanding, and his tiny hands reached instinctively toward Elias whenever he entered the nursery. The doctors had reduced their monitoring to twice a day, and Dr. Bennett had officially declared that the baby was out of danger. Elias should have been relieved. He was relieved. But something had been nagging at him for the past several days, a feeling he couldn't shake. It started with the formula. Elias had noticed it by accident, a small inconsistency in the nursery's emergency supplies. He had been checking the expiration dates on the formula cans, just in case, and he'd noticed that one of them had been moved. Not by much, just an inch or two from where he'd placed it. He'd thought nothing of it at first. The nurses came and went, and it was entirely possible that someone had rearranged the cabinet without thinking. But then he'd noticed the same can in a different position the next day. And the day after that. Elias was a baker. He had spent years running a struggling business where every penny mattered. Every inventory detail could mean the difference between profit and loss. He had trained himself to notice small changes, to track supplies with the precision of a military quartermaster. And what he was noticing now didn't make sense. He marked the cans with a small blue dot, placing them in a specific order. The next morning, the order was wrong. The cans had been replaced. The following day, he swapped the marked cans with new ones, hiding the suspicious containers in a locked cabinet that only he and Dr. Bennett had access to. When the doctor examined them, his expression turned grave. "There's something in these cans that shouldn't be there," he said, his voice quiet. "I can't identify it without sending it to a lab, but someone's trying to hurt Luca," Elias finished. Dr. Bennett nodded slowly. "The question is who?" The answer, when it came, was more disturbing than Elias had anticipated. He had begun paying closer attention to the mansion's routines, noting who came and went, which staff members had access to the nursery, when the security cameras might be disabled. And he had noticed something strange. The cameras covering the nursery hallway experienced unexplained outages at regular intervals. Always at night. Always when only a handful of staff members remained awake. And always, Elias realized with a jolt, when Adrian's cousin was in the house. Marcus Bellini was 45, tall and lean, with slicked-back dark hair and narrow green eyes that seemed to see everything without revealing anything. He visited the mansion frequently, arriving with expensive gifts and charming smiles, and the staff had always considered him one of the more pleasant members of the family. Elias didn't trust him. It wasn't anything Marcus did openly. The man was unfailingly polite, always complimenting the food, always asking about Luca's progress. But Elias had spent years reading people in his bakery, learning to distinguish genuine warmth from performative interest. And Marcus Bellini's interest in Luca made his skin prickle. He brought his concerns to Marco De Luca, who listened in silence and then nodded slowly. "I'll have Victor look into it." Victor Ramirez was the mansion's chief surveillance technician, a lean man in his mid-30s with wire-rimmed glasses and remarkably quick fingers. When Marco asked him to check the security logs, he discovered something alarming. The missing footage hadn't resulted from equipment failure. Someone with administrator-level access had deliberately erased those recordings. And the access credentials belonged to Marcus Bellini. Elias's stomach turned cold. "He's been sabotaging the formula," he said. "He's been trying to make Lucas sick, to make it look like a medical complication so he can take over the family," Marco finished. "If Adrian's son dies, Marcus becomes the closest blood relative. Everything would pass to him. It was the oldest story in the world: power, greed, betrayal within the family. But knowing the shape of the conspiracy didn't make it any less terrifying, because the threat wasn't just to Luca. It was to everyone in the mansion. Elias didn't have time to act on his discovery. The day after Victor confirmed Marcus's involvement, Elias left the mansion through the service entrance, intending to walk to a nearby market for specialty ingredients. It was a short walk, one he'd made several times before, and Marco had assigned 2 guards to follow at a discreet distance. But a delivery van blocked the narrow street at exactly the wrong moment, and by the time the guards realized Elias had been separated from them, it was too late. A gloved hand covered his mouth, a sharp sting pierced his neck, and the world dissolved into white and gray. When Elias woke up, he was tied to a steel chair in what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse. His wrists were bound behind his back, his ankles secured to the chair legs, and his head was pounding with the aftereffects of whatever drug they'd used on him. The air smelled of rust and seawater and the faint metallic tang of blood. And Marcus Bellini was standing in front of him, smiling. "You've been a complication, Elias," Marcus said, his voice smooth as silk. "You were never supposed to become so necessary." Elias said nothing. He was too busy assessing his surroundings, counting the armed guards he could see, noting the exits and the shadows, and the frozen loading dock beyond the broken windows. His Omega instincts were screaming at him to fight, to flee, to protect himself from the alpha menace that surrounded him. But he also knew that fighting now would be useless. He needed to wait, to conserve his strength, to look for an opening. "The baby," Elias said finally. "Where is Luca?" Marcus's smile widened. "Don't worry. He's here too. I wanted Adrian to have a choice, the baby or the Omega. I'm curious to see which one he'll choose." Elias felt his blood run cold. "You're using me as leverage?" "I'm using everyone as leverage," Marcus said pleasantly. "That's the beauty of this plan. Either Adrian sacrifices the son he spent a month trying to save, or he sacrifices the Omega, who's become the center of his household. Either way, he loses something he loves, and I win what I've always wanted." Elias didn't dignify that with a response. He had never been the type to give his enemies the satisfaction of seeing him afraid, and he wasn't about to start now. Instead, he closed his eyes and thought of Luca, the baby's tiny fingers curling around his thumb, the way he smiled in his sleep, the fierce determination that had kept him alive against all odds. Whatever happened, Elias would protect that child, even if it cost him everything. The hours that followed were a blur of cold, fear, and the slow drip of time. Marcus left him alone for long stretches, and Elias used those moments to test his bonds, to memorize the layout of the warehouse, to plan for the moment when an opportunity might present itself. He thought about Adrian, the way the alpha had kissed him, the way he'd said, "I don't deserve you," with such raw vulnerability, and he clung to that memory like a lifeline. He thought about Luca, about the baby's soft weight in his arms, about the way he'd smiled in his sleep. He thought about Penelope, about all the moments he'd never get to have with her, and he promised himself that he wouldn't let Luca suffer the same fate. When Marcus finally returned, he was accompanied by a small group of armed men, and in the center of them was a woman Elias didn't recognize, a former nanny, he would later learn, who had been working for Marcus all along. She held a car seat, and inside it was Luca, his tiny face red from crying, his body trembling with exhaustion. "You see," Marcus said, gesturing toward the baby. "He's here. He's alive. For now." Elias strained against his bonds, his Omega instincts screaming at him to protect the child. "If you hurt him, I will kill you. I don't care how. I don't care when. I will find a way, and I will end you." Marcus laughed. "Brave words from a man tied to a chair." "They're not words," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "They're promises." Marcus's smile faltered, just for a moment. Then he shrugged and turned away. "We'll see who keeps their promises first." The attack came at dawn. Elias heard the explosions first, shattering windows, screaming metal, the thunder of flash grenades that turned the warehouse into a storm of light and sound. The guards scattered, shouting orders that no one could hear, and then the Valeni forces were pouring through every entrance, their black uniforms a blur of controlled violence. Marco De Luca led the first assault team, barking orders with the precision of the former army officer he was. He moved through the chaos like a force of nature, and behind him came more men, dozens of them, advancing with the disciplined efficiency that had made the Valeni organization one of the most feared in the city. Elias watched it all through half-lidded eyes, still tied to his chair, his head throbbing from the drug's lingering effects. He saw Marcus try to flee, saw Marco intercept him near the loading dock, saw the struggle that ended with Marcus's hands bound behind his back and his perfect charcoal overcoat ruined by the dirty concrete. And then Adrian was there. He appeared at the edge of Elias's vision like a ghost, his dark overcoat billowing, his eyes fixed on Elias's face with an intensity that made Elias's breath catch. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and knelt in front of the chair, his hands moving to Elias's wrists, working at the bonds with a controlled desperation that was almost unnerving. "You're okay," Adrian said, his voice rough. "You're okay. I've got you. I'm fine," Elias managed. "The guards, there were too many. I know. We found them. Luca, Elias said, the name escaping in a breathless rush. Marcus said he was here. He said he was going to make you choose. Adrian's expression darkened. Luca is safe. Marco found him 3 minutes ago. He's with Dr. Bennett in the transport, and Adrian's voice cracked on the next word. He's fine. He was scared, but he's fine. Elias sagged against the chair, the tension flooding out of him so fast that his vision blurred. Thank God. Thank you, Adrian said, and there was something in his voice that Elias had never heard before. A rawness, a vulnerability that stripped away every layer of control and left nothing but the truth. You could have died. You could have. I can't. He stopped, and Elias realized that Adrian's hands were shaking. The alpha who had faced down assassins and rival gangs, and the entire New York underworld was trembling, his eyes bright with something that looked terrifyingly like tears. Hey, Elias said softly. Hey, I'm all right. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Adrian made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, and then he was pulling Elias into his arms, holding him so tightly that Elias could barely breathe. But Elias didn't want to breathe. He wanted to stay in this moment forever, wrapped in the arms of a man who had just destroyed his own cousin to save him. I couldn't lose you, Adrian whispered into his hair. I couldn't. You're the only thing that's made sense since Isabella died. You and Luca. He pulled back, his eyes searching Elias's face. You're everything. Elias felt his heart stutter in his chest. Adrian. I know this is insane, Adrian said quickly. I know we barely know each other. I know you came here to save my son, not to deal with all of this. But I need you to understand. When they took you, I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I was ready to burn the entire city to the ground to find you. And that's not just gratitude, Elias. That's not just obligation. I know, Elias said, and he was surprised to find that his voice was steady, even though his heart was racing. I know, because I feel it too. Adrian stared at him. You do? I've been trying to pretend I don't, Elias admitted. I came here to help Luca. I told myself that was the only thing that mattered. But somewhere along the way, you stopped being just the baby's father. You started being, he shook his head. I don't have words for what you are. Adrian's hand came up to cradle his cheek, thumb brushing across the high curve of his cheekbone. Then let me show you, he said, and leaned in. The kiss was everything Elias had been too afraid to imagine. Soft at first, almost tentative, as if Adrian was afraid of breaking him. But then Elias made a small sound in the back of his throat, and the alpha's control shattered. The kiss deepened, hungry and desperate, tasting of salt and snow and the promise of something neither of them had dared to hope for. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. We need to get out of here, Elias said, his voice shaky. There are bodies everywhere. The police they won't, Adrian said, pulling Elias to his feet. I own the police, and the mayor, and half the city council. No one is going to touch us. Elias laughed despite himself. Of course you own the police. I own a lot of things, Adrian said, and there was a hint of his old arrogance in the words. But the only thing I want to own right now is you. Elias reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw, the sharp cheekbones, the soft skin beneath his eyes. You already do, Adrian. You already do. In the weeks that followed, the mansion began to change. Not just the kitchen, not just the atmosphere, but the very fabric of the house itself. Adrian started spending more time at home, delegating responsibilities to trusted lieutenants so he could be present for Luca's feedings and Elias's quiet moments in the nursery. He learned to make coffee the way Elias liked it, strong, with a splash of milk and a hint of cinnamon. And he started bringing it to him every morning, a small ritual that Elias found himself cherishing. They talked late into the night, sharing stories about their pasts, their losses, their hopes for the future. Elias told Adrian about Penelope, about the 18 hours she'd lived and the grief that had nearly consumed him. Adrian told Elias about Isabella, about the love they'd shared and the guilt he still carried for not being able to save her. "I thought I would never love anyone again," Adrian admitted one night, his head resting on Elias's shoulder as they watched Lucas sleep. "I thought that part of me had died with her." Elias pressed a kiss through his hair. "And now I know I was wrong." Adrian turned to look at him, his dark eyes soft in the dim light. "I still love Isabella. I always will. But you've made me realize that love isn't a limited resource. It's not something you run out of. It's something that grows, that expands, that makes room for more. You've made room in my heart for something I never thought I'd feel again." Elias felt tears pricking at his eyes. "I feel the same way. I thought I'd never love anyone after Mateo. After Penelope. I thought I was broken, that I didn't deserve to be happy. But you." He reached out and touched Adrian's face. "You make me believe that I can have this, that I deserve this." "You do," Adrian said fiercely. "You deserve everything." He leaned in and kissed Elias, slow and tender, and Elias let himself melt into it, let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he was allowed to be happy. A full year later, winter returned to New York, and the snow fell over Queens like a benediction. Elias stood in the kitchen of his new bakery, his hands buried in a batch of dough, the familiar rhythm of kneading soothing the edges of his grief. The shop was warm and bright, the windows fogged with steam, the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread drifting out onto the sidewalk to draw in customers from the cold. The sign above the door read "Little Luca's Bakery" in gold letters, and Elias still smiled every time he saw it. He heard the bell ring, and then a familiar voice called out, "We're here." Elias wiped his hands on his apron and emerged from the kitchen, his heart lifting at the sight that greeted him. Adrian stood near the door, his dark overcoat dusted with snow, and in his arms was a lively 1-year-old with thick black hair, bright gray eyes, and an endlessly curious smile. Luca spotted Elias and immediately began squirming, reaching out with both arms, his tiny voice babbling an enthusiastic, "Mama, Mama." Elias laughed, the sound surprising him with its lightness. He crossed the room and lifted Luca from Adrian's arms, pressing a kiss to the baby's forehead. "Hello, little love. Did you miss me?" Luca responded by grabbing a fistful of Elias's curls and yanking with all his tiny strength, which was apparently the highest form of affection a 1-year-old could offer. "He's been asking for you all morning," Adrian said, stepping closer. "I couldn't get him to eat his breakfast. He kept pointing at the door and saying your name. He's going to be a baker, I swear," Elias said, bouncing the baby on his hip. "The boy has good instincts. He can tell when bread is fresh." Adrian's lips twitched. "Or he just knows you're the softest touch in New York." "Someone has to be soft around here," Elias retorted. "You're enough of a hard case for the both of us." Adrian laughed, a sound that had become more frequent over the past year, a sound that Elias had learned to treasure. It had taken time, more time than Elias had expected, for Adrian to shed the armor he'd built around himself after Isabella's death. But bit by bit, Elias had helped him find his way back to something resembling joy. The moment that had truly changed things had come 3 months after the warehouse. Elias had been settling Luca into his crib when Adrian had appeared in the doorway, looking more anxious than Elias had ever seen him. "I need to tell you something," he'd said. "What is it?" Adrian had hesitated, a rare moment of uncertainty. I found out today that Marcus's men were planning to kill you regardless of the outcome. If I'd chosen Luca, they would have killed you. If I'd chosen you, they would have killed Luca and then killed you anyway. There was no scenario where you survived. Elias had felt a chill run down his spine. But you found me in time. I found you in time because I chose to come for you, Adrian said. I didn't know about their backup plan. I just knew I couldn't lose you. And that scared me more than anything I've ever faced. Elias had reached out and taken his hand. It scared me too. But we're here. We're safe. We're together. That's what matters. Adrian had looked at him with such gratitude that Elias had felt his heart crack open. I don't deserve you, he'd said. Probably not, Elias had agreed. But I'm not going anywhere anyway. That night, Adrian had pulled him into his arms and kissed him with a tenderness that had made Elias weep. And the next morning, Elias had realized that his grief for Penelope, while still present, had finally begun to ease. Now, standing in the warm bakery with Luca in his arms and Adrian at his side, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Joy. Not just contentment or relief or the absence of pain, but real, uncomplicated joy. The kind of joy that came from knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with the people he was supposed to be with. I have something for you, Adrian said, reaching into his coat pocket. Elias raised an eyebrow. If it's another expensive watch, I'm going to throw it out the window. It's not a watch. It's something else. Adrian pulled out a small velvet box and opened it, revealing a simple diamond ring set in platinum. I know we haven't talked about this. I know we're still figuring things out. But I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Elias. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to raise Luca with you. I want to build a home with you. He took a breath. I want to marry you. Elias stared at the ring, then at Adrian, then back at the ring. His eyes were filling with tears, and Luca was tugging at his hair, and the bakery was warm and bright, and everything felt impossibly perfect. Yes, he said, the word coming out as a sob. Yes, of course yes. Adrian let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a very long time. His hands trembled slightly as he took the ring from the box and slipped it onto Elias's finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for him. I love you, Adrian said, his voice hoarse. I don't know when it happened. I don't know how. But I love you, Elias. I love you more than anything. Elias reached up and cupped his face, the ring glinting in the bakery's golden light. I love you too, Adrian. I've loved you since the night you carried Luca into my bakery. I just didn't know how to say it. Adrian leaned in and kissed him, and in the background, Luca gurgled happily and clapped his tiny hands. The customers in the bakery, a handful of regulars who had come to know the story, began to clap too, and someone let out a cheer, and Elias thought that this was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that made everything worth it. Later, after the bakery had closed, after Luca had been put to bed, Elias and Adrian stood in the nursery of their new home, a modest brownstone in the same neighborhood as the bakery, far from the cold grandeur of the Valeni mansion. I still can't believe you gave it all up, Elias said softly, watching Luca sleep. Adrian came up behind him and wrapped his arms around his waist. I didn't give anything up. I just rearranged things. The business still runs. I just run it differently now. You sold half your assets, Elias said. You donated millions to that foundation. I invested in a future, Adrian corrected. Our future. Luca's future. The money doesn't matter. You matter. He matters. Elias leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of Adrian's chest against his back. You're a good alpha, Adrian. The best I've ever known. Adrian pressed a kiss to his hair. You've made me a better alpha. You've made me a better man. I don't know how to repay you for that. Just keep loving me, Elias said. That's all I want. Always, Adrian promised. Always. The snow continued to fall outside, softening the world in a blanket of white. Inside, the warmth of the nursery held them close, a tiny family bound together by love and loss and the strange, inexplicable mercy of a grief that had finally found its purpose. Sometimes, Elias thought, God's greatest miracles didn't arrive with thunder or flashing lights. Sometimes they came wrapped in heartbreak, hidden inside the people the world had overlooked. He had believed he'd lost everything when he'd lost Penelope. His daughter, his bakery, his partner, his future, all taken from him in the span of a few devastating months. But God had still had a purpose for the love that remained in his heart. Adrian had believed power could protect the people he loved, until he discovered that true strength was found in compassion, humility, and family. The empire he'd built had never made him happy, but a small bakery in Queens, a lively child, and an Omega who loved him without condition, those had changed everything. And Luca, sweet, miraculous Luca, had never chosen the richest or the strongest or the most powerful person. He had simply chosen the heart that loved him without condition, the heart that had held him in the darkest hours of his life, that had whispered lullabies and promised safety and refused to let go. Elias watched the snow fall outside his bakery window, Luca asleep and the carrier strapped to his chest, and he knew that this was the life he was meant to live. Not perfect, not without pain, but full, rich, overflowing with the kind of love that had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Thank you, he whispered to the empty room, to Penelope, to Isabella, to whatever force in the universe had brought him to this moment. Thank you for giving me a second chance. In the back of the bakery, Adrian was making coffee, his strong hands moving with surprising gentleness as he measured grounds and boiled water. He caught Elias's eye through the open doorway and smiled. A real smile, warm and unguarded, the kind of smile that had been impossible a year ago. Are you coming to bed soon? He asked. Elias laughed softly. It's 7 in the morning. I wasn't talking about sleep, Adrian said, and his smile turned mischievous. Elias rolled his eyes, but he was smiling too. You're impossible. You love me anyway. I do, Elias said, and the words felt like a prayer. I really, really do. He walked out of the bakery, Luca warm against his chest, Adrian's hand finding his as they stepped into the snow. The city stretched out before them, cold and glittering and full of possibilities. And Elias knew, with absolute certainty, that this was only the beginning.